Welcome back, tenacious tenders of the WordGarden. In the immortal words of the Rolling Stones, you can't always get what you want. Sometimes in programming, you think you're going to get a legitimate value, and you end up with nothing. Well, in Swift, the absence of value is called nil. It's different from zero or the empty string, and we're going to learn how to deal with nil using a concept called optionals. Now, optionals can be tricky. They're not common in most programming languages, but working with optionals will make your programs less prone to errors and will make you a better programmer. Now, we'll give you some practical examples here to build our app and learn about optional concepts, but you might also want to return to this video if you need a refresher at any point in the future. Again, these concepts are sometimes a little difficult to master the first time you go through, and also explore the exercises at the end of the section if you're using the accompanying online book. Now in this section, we're going to cover optionals and optional wrapping, force unwrapping with the exclamation point, when to do it and when it is dangerous. We'll learn about various methods for testing for and dealing with optionals, including if let, and guardlet. You'll learn to use the double question mark and nil coalescing operator, and we'll cover two additional topics. We'll use the trimmingCharacters in method and CharacterSets, specifically the whitespaces character set, to remove any whitespaces that the user might enter. Now we'll work mostly in the playground in this video, and at the end we'll have a challenge problem for you to apply what you've learned in the playground in your WordGarden, and we'll solve that in the next video. Big learning is not optional, so let's code. So here's the problem we're trying to solve. We can currently type more than one character into the text field, but we only want one character at a time, because the user just guesses a single letter. Now it's a little hard to see, but if the letter I is typed over and over again, you see how you can see more than one letter I in the text field here? So we're going to want to grab the last character that the user has typed each time the user types a character. Now we're also going to have to deal with the fact that if the user presses delete over the last character, then there is no character in the text field. So if we ask for the last character, we might get a character, but if there's the empty string, we might get nothing. And in Swift, nothing is called nil. Now dealing with this something or nothing occurrence is where optionals come in, so let's describe the concept in a bit more depth and build your programming skills. Now in order to make sure that we understand the concepts, we're going to work in a playground. So let's go up under File, select New, and then select Playground. This will be a blank playground. Click Next. What do we call this? Optionals. I'm going to save mine to the desktop, click Create, and expand the window to take up the full screen. Now in our actual WordGarden app, we're going to deal with the guest letter text field's text property. Now, since we don't have the text field in our playground, we'll just refer to a variable called text. So I'm going to highlight the str, backspace over it, and make sure that it says var text equals, and then within double quotes, capital Swift. Now I'll do a quick shift return at the end of the line here to make sure that my playground is working okay, and I can see over here on the right hand side the word Swift shows up, so that says yep, this is working. But sometimes playgrounds can be quirky. Just as a reminder, if your Xcode Playground isn't displaying results, you can go up here to the right hand corner, click on this icon to expose the inspectors pane. The first inspector that should show up is the identity and type inspector, and we can go down here to platform settings and switch from iOS to macOS. Now if we do that, we've also got to go up here and change import UI kit, which is iOS specific, to import playground support, spelled just like you see it here, and that'll show up in code completion too. Now if you still have problems with playgrounds, sometimes you just need to quit Xcode and restart it. I've noticed in the version of Xcode that I'm using, sometimes if I double click on a playground to open up Xcode with that playground, the playground will be empty. That can be a little bit of a freak out, but if you quit Xcode and then try to do that again, you can usually see everything inside of your playground. So Xcode playgrounds have been notoriously quirky. Another good tip, it's a good idea to reboot your Mac. I try to do it every day just because Xcode is complicated, iOS is complicated, sometimes odd behaviors can show up. So there's some tips for you. Let's return to our regularly scheduled coding. So strings aren't formal arrays, but they do have some of the characteristics of arrays. And one of those is the calculated property count. So if we just say text.count, just like we could with an array, then press shift return, we get the number 5 over here on the right, telling us that there are 5 characters in the string Swift. Now again, strings aren't full-blown arrays, so we can't say text square bracket 4 close square bracket and do a shift return. We'll get an error that says subscript is unavailable, you can't subscript a string. Alright, but what we want in this example is the last character, and the way that we could do that is use this calculated property last. So if we say dot last here, we see code completion says this gives us the last element in the collection. A string is a collection of characters. And look at what else we see up here. We say this returns a character, so it's important it doesn't return a string. We'll have to deal with that. But then there's also this question mark in here. What's up with that? Well, sometimes we ask our code to come up with values and there might not be any value. That's what the question mark refers to. And the last property is a good example of that. If we say text.last and text contains the word Swift, it's going to give us a T. But if we say text.last and we're trying to do that on an empty string, there is no last character in the empty string. We're going to get nothing. Let's see this in action. I'll do a shift return. T shows up here on the right. I'm still seeing some error text down below. Again, this is the quirkiness of Playground, but if you click on the square in the bottom here and then click on play again, the errors will go away. Again, we still see the T on the right-hand side. And so let's test out the example of the empty string. Down below this, I'll say text equals, and then just open and close double quotes, nothing inside. That's the empty string. Then I'll say text.last, shift return, and I see nil over here on the right-hand side. Nil means nothing. You want the last character? I got nothing for you, because there is no last character. And just an important distinction in here, if I type in nil equals empty string, shift return, I get a false on the right-hand side because nil is distinctly different from empty string. Empty string is something, it's a string with nothing inside of it, but that's considered to be a legitimate string. Also, if I type nil equals 0, shift return, that's false too. So nil is not 0. 0 is a valid number. Nil is no number at all. Just a black hole, a void, nothing inside of it, an empty box. Now let's see what happens when we print this stuff out. We'll say print, open parens, Xcode closes parens, open double quotes, Xcode closes double quotes. In between the quotes, we'll type the last letter in, and then we'll say string interp, which is slash open and close parens, is string interp slash open and close parens. And then we'll go back, and I'm going to put a single quote on either side of the string interpolation. I don't need the single quotes, but it'll just make the value stand out a little bit more in the print statement. Then I'll put text inside the first two parentheses, and in between the last set of parentheses, I'll put text.last. Notice that code completion shows up because I'm typing inside a completed string interpolation parentheses that are inside of double quotes. And when I press shift return, whoa, look what I see down here. The last letter in Swift is optional T. I didn't put the word optional in there. What's that all about? Well, remember, if we option click on the word last up here, we see that, hey, this is a character question mark over the slides. The question mark after character means character is an optional. That means that this value last here might return a character, or it might return nothing. It might return nil. Now, sometimes you hear of optionals referred to as a value being optionally wrapped. If it helps, you can consider this to be like an outside box around your value. If you look inside the box, you might see a legitimate value, a character, or you might look in the box and you might see nothing, nil. Now, when we had said print last.text and we saw the optional wrapper in the print output, how do we get rid of the wrapper? Well, one way is we can force unwrap the value, and we do that with an exclamation point. That throws away the optional wrapper and it gets at directly what's inside of it. So that's why we've got this square bracket here just around the character part, not in the optional wrapper. See down here, text.last exclamation point prints out just the lowercase o, since in this example text contains the word hello and no word optional is around it. Cool, so let's use that. Now there's going to be a catch with nil, and I'll show you that in just a bit. So you see down here in our output where it says the last letter in Swift is optional T. Let's get rid of the optional. What we'll do is we'll go up here and put an exclamation point just after the last property in text. Then I'll click below line 11 and do a shift return. And we see the optional goes away. It says the last letter in Swift is T. Nice! So let's do the same thing down below for our empty string. I'm going to copy this whole line 6 here. I'm going to paste it in line 12, do a shift return, and oh! I get a fatal error, unexpectedly found nil, when unwrapping an optional value. Remember, when we put the exclamation point in there, we say throw away the wrapper, look at what's inside. If we expect a character to be returned and it's not, we get an error. That's a type-safe programming language in action. Nil ain't no character type. Error. Let's see how we can deal with this. First, let's go back to our code. I'm going to comment out the troublemaking line. I'm also going to comment out the nil equals empty string and nil equals 0 here. And I can put in some extra comments behind here just for some notes. So reminder, nil does not equal empty string. And then below that, reminder, nil does not equal 0. Then back to the slide. So if the problem we're dealing with is we're trying to force unwrap last when it's got nil inside, why don't we first check to see if text.last has nil inside. If it does not equal nil, then it's okay for us to go ahead and force unwrap it. If it does equal nil, then that must mean that the user has backspace, so there's nothing in guessed a letter. So what we should do is just set the text property equal to the empty string. Now there's one last bit of trickiness here. Remember, text is a string, but text.last gives us a character. See that up here? So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to convert that returned character to a string. That's why the word string is around here in parentheses. We could also use string interpolation for this too. Let's go ahead and try this out. So we'll say if text.last does not equal to nil, open and close curlies, text equals text.last, force unwrap that with an exclamation point, else, open and close curlies, text equals empty string. And just to remind you, if you do a shift return here, you get an error, and the reason for that is option click on our last here. Remember, this says that this is a character. Actually, it's an optional character, but if we option click on top of text, we can see that is a string. So we need to convert the character to a string. You can do that by preceding this with a type name string and then wrapping it in parentheses like I showed on the previous slide, or you can use string interpolation, which wraps this in double quotes and it's got a slash in front of the parentheses. Let's use string interpolation. Shift return down below. We've got no error, but let's put in a print statement here just to make sure. So we'll say print, and then in double quotes, text now contains string interp, and inside of the string interpolation, let's put single quotes around this as well, and we'll put in text. See, once again, once I set up my string interpolation first, I get code completion, accept text, then at the end of our code, do shift return, we get the output that we expect, empty string. Now another way we could deal with this is if let. Sometimes you want to do something with that unwrapped value, so it would help to create a constant that contains the unwrapped value if it's not nil, and that's what if let does. The way to read this statement is if we can create a constant, remember let creates a constant, from text.last, meaning it's not nil. So if text.last is not nil, then we're going to create that constant using the let statement, and that constant is going to be called last char. If we can do that, then we do what's inside the first set of curlies, and that last char has scope for the first set of curlies. It only lives inside that first set of curlies. But what we can do is convert it to a string and assign it to text. Else, if we get a nil from text.last, then we couldn't create a non-nil value in last char. That means we don't execute the first set of curlies. We instead go into the else clause. You might not need an else clause, but in this case we do, because what we want to do if text.last is equal to nil is we want to set text equal to the empty string. So let's try this out. I'm going to highlight these 5 lines of the whole if clause, copy them with a command C, do a command slash to comment them out. Then I'm going to paste this down below, and I'm going to make the change so the first line will read if let, and then I'll set that to last char equals text.last. Then if this is true that I have a non-nil value, I can take this value last char that I just created and assign that to text. Now I'm going to get an error up here because last char is a character and I need to turn that into a string. So I'm just going to precede that with the type name string and wrap it in parentheses. Then do a shift enter down below. I get the same result that I had before, but instead of checking to see if text.last did not have nil inside, instead we check to see can we create a constant called last char that is not nil. Let's copy and paste this and put this up top so we can see what the result is when we have something inside of text.last. So I'll highlight all of this text here, command C, I'm going to scroll to the top and I'm going to paste it in just before I set the text variable to equal to empty string. Then if I do a shift return here, my code will execute through line 13. I can see the first time we go through when text has Swift in it, it says text now contains T, but the second time, if I scroll to the end and press shift return at the end of my code, when text has the empty string, we see text now contains empty string. If let, working great in both situations. Hey, up here, let's prove that last char only has scope in the first set of curly braces. So if down below here in my line 13, I type in print and then in between the parentheses start to type in last char, you see how the constant last char doesn't show up in code completion? That's because Xcode tells me, hey, last char doesn't exist outside of the curlies. I'll delete this line, go back up here in between the curlies, and in this positive condition here, if I can create last char, I can type in print, open parens, and if I start to type in last char, sure enough, it shows up in code completion. That means it has scope inside these curlies, but not outside. If I delete this, then try to see, hey, is last char down here in the else clause? And no, it doesn't show up in code completion. So again, that constant that we create via if let only exists inside the first set of curlies. Now you've actually seen if-let before, but we didn't spend a lot of time describing what's going on here. This is when we created our PlaySound function in the You Are Awesome app. Remember that? When we call this function, we pass in a string named name. Now that's supposed to be the name of one of the sound files in our asset catalog. Now, if we could successfully convert this into an NS data asset, it's not nil, then we created a constant called sound, and that lived inside the first set of curlies. If not, we jumped down to the second set of curlies, there was no constant named sound, and we printed out this error. Now, another way we can deal with optional values that might be nil is to use the nil coalescing operator. In Swift, that's two question marks next to each other, like you see here. Now, when you see two question marks, Swift will say, first look to the left of the two question marks. If this optional value is not nil, then treat it as if I'm force unwrapping it and return that unwrapped value. But if the value on the left is nil, then ignore what's on the left and use the default value that's provided on the right. Just make sure that what's on the right is the same type as what's on the left. And that's what we've got to deal with. It's a little bit more complicated for us because we can't simply put an empty string on the right-hand side. Remember, text.last, if we option click on top of it, returns a character. Well, if text.last returns nil, what we really want to do is we want to return an empty string, but we can't do that inside of the nil coalescing because what's on the right-hand side has to be the same type as the left-hand side. And an empty string doesn't have a character inside it. It's a string of length 0. That's not a character. So what I've done here is I've just put a space inside, and I'll show you how we can strip the space out later on. Now, either the left side or the right side is going to give us a character. Text is a string, so we got string out front here to take whatever we get back from nil coalescing, which is a character, and convert it to a string. But first, let's try out the nil coalescing operator in our code. So I'll put in a comment down here just to remind you that this is the nil coalescing operator, two question marks, and we'll say text equals, and before we continue, let's highlight the if statement up here and command slash to comment that out. Then we'll say text.last, question mark, which is the nil coalescing operator, and an empty string. And we'll run into some problems. And the first problem that we're going to have is, wait, text.last gives us a character, the empty string is not a character, and that error will show up. But first I'm going to highlight this print statement up here, copy it with the command C, and paste it down below. And if I try to do a shift return to run this code, Xcode is telling me I've got an error here. So I'm going to put a space in between the double quotes. So now I've got a character on the left and a character on the right. They're of the same type. Now I'm still going to run into a problem because the nil coalescing operator will give us back a character, but text, if you option click on it, is a string. So we need to convert the result of the nil coalescing operator into a string. You can put the word string out front and surround it in parentheses like I'd showed you on the previous slide. Shift enter, that works perfectly. Although we can see we've got the issue down here where it says text now contains a space instead of the empty string. And we can also use string interpolation up here too. So if I backspace over string and put in double quotes, slash, and then double quotes at the end, press shift return, same result. Now we could change this space character to an empty string with 3 lines of code. Right after the nil coalescing operator, we'll add a new line and we'll say if text equals, and then in between double quotes, a space, then in between the curlies, we can say text equals empty string. And if we shift return, we see down below, we're now getting text now contains empty string. But I'm going to show you there's a technique we can use on the same line where we get our nil coalescing character that will also strip out any space characters. So let's highlight these 3 lines of the if condition, then command slash to comment them out. And the technique I'm about to show you, I could actually use dot notation right after the double quote that closes our string interpolation, but it's a little bit easier to read if I first convert the string interpolation back to using string and wrapping it in parentheses. So that's what I'll do first. So again, I've got my whole nil coalescing statement inside of string and parentheses. So if I go to the end of the code and do shift return, I see, yep, it still runs, no errors. Now this technique I'm going to use is a string method called trimmingCharacters. So right after the string conversion here, right after the closing parenthesis, I'm going to type .trim, and I can see code completion shows this method trimming characters in. The description is listed as returns a new string by removing from both ends of the string any characters contained in a given character set. That means if we pass in a set of characters, we can say if any characters in the character set are at the front of the string or at the end of the string, trim them all away and give me what's left. So now if our whole string is a single space and we say trim out the spaces, we'll end up with an empty string, and that's what we want. Well, how do we pass in spaces as this character set parameter? Well, remember, you can always consult Apple's online documentation, so I've pulled up the page for character set. And if we scroll down here, we can see that there are a bunch of different character sets, including capitalized letters, control characters, decimal digits. And if we scroll all the way to near the bottom, we see one called whitespaces. Now, the description's a little jargony in here, but essentially what this says is whitespaces are considered to be any spaces as well as any tabs. That's what we want. Let's go back to our code. And again, in character set, if we do dot notation, we can see all of the different options in here. Their description is in code completion too. We want to find white spaces, press return on this, then go down below, press shift return, and we see we get the exact result that we want using one line of code. And again, what we're saying here is take what's inside of the string, run trimming characters on it, trim out any white spaces that are in the beginning or the end of the string. Since our string is all white spaces, just a single space, it'll trim that out and it'll return the empty string into this variable text that's at the left of the equal sign. And just to show you this technique again, we can say down here, let new text equals, and then we'll put in a new string which has got a bunch of spaces, the word Swift, a bunch more spaces, then dot trimming characters in, we'll select dot white spaces, then down below we'll say print new text, shift return, and actually what we can do is also say comma new text.count afterward, and we see down below we see Swift, all the white spaces in the beginning and in the end are trimmed out. This is only 5 characters in length. Nice! Now I'm going to introduce another technique which is very similar to if-let. It's called guard-let, but before we can introduce guard-let, we've got to introduce how guard works. So the guard statement is sort of like a bouncer, and most of the time you're going to see guard used inside of functions. Now just like the bouncer at the club, the guard takes a look and says, hey, do you meet the criteria? Should I let you inside of the velvet ropes? If not, the guard statement is going to bounce you out of the function. It's going to return you. But if everything is okay, it'll let you through. Now let's look at the code we're about to write. The function is called coolCheck. I know it sounds so nerdy. We're passing in a name and we're passing in a Boolean parameter if they are cool or not cool. Now inside we say guard cool else. Well, if they are cool, then the bouncer passes them through. The velvet ropes are the end of the curlies. However, if they do not meet the criteria, they are not cool. Cool is false, then we hit the else statement inside and we return. Now every guard statement has got to have a return or some mechanism to get them out of the function that they're in. Now that we know how to use this, let's try it out. So back in our playground, we'll put in the same function we just saw, func coolCheck, open parens, name colon string, comma cool colon bool, open and close curlies, then inside the function, if the function is the club and the guard statement is our bouncer, we'll put the bouncer up front. We'll say guard cool, the condition is cool. We'll follow this with else, open and close curlies. Now the guard is going to check to see if the condition is met, if cool is true. The curlies at the end of the else statement are the velvet ropes. You can go to the end of the curly and stay in the function. If the condition is not met, we've got this else clause here. Inside the curlies, we put in return. Cool, you get through. Not cool, you're returned, you're bounced. Now we'll put in a print statement in here that says, I love being around cool people. I am glad you are here. String interp, name. Then down here, let's call coolCheck. And as our parameters, the name will be Jolene and cool will be true. Jolene is one of my TAs. She's very cool. She sings in music videos and she's an engineering intern at Google. And down below that, we'll call coolCheck again, and the name we'll pass in will be Prof G, and Prof G is decidedly not cool, so we'll put in cool false. Shift return. Let's take a look at the results. We see, I love being around cool people. I'm glad you're here, Jolene. Nothing shows up for Prof G. He was bounced from the club, kicked out of the function with the guard statements, return in the else clause. And you can keep all of these playgrounds as notes to refer to later on, so let's put a comment statement up above this function that says guard statement dash acts like a bouncer in a function period, send you home early if you don't pass the test. Now down below, I'll put in another comment that says guard-let, and let's go over to the slide and see how that works. So guard-let is very close to if-let. The guard-let statement tests to see if something is not nil. If it is not nil, then it creates the value after the let statement, and that value has the scope for the rest of the function. So this is how it differs from the if-let statement. In if-let, the value that's created has the scope of just inside the first set of curlies. In guard-let, that constant that's created lives for the rest of the function. Now, guard-let can do this because if it is nil, then we hit the else clause, and inside the curlies, we have a return statement. Guard says, you nil? If you are, you're returned. Here's a little example, but rather than go through it on the slide, let's go ahead and type it into the playground. So under our comment, we'll say func, and we'll call this return last character. And in between our parentheses, our parameter is called text, colon, that's of type string. Then we'll put in an arrow because this function will return a value, and the value it will return will be a string. Open and close curlies, then we'll say guard let, last character will be the constant we try to create, equals text.last. Now we follow this with a failing condition, so we say else, open and close curlies, and in between the curlies we put in what we do if text.last equals nil, and what we need to do is we need to return, and to the right of the arrow, when we define this function, we promise to return a string, and so if we get nil from text.last, we want to return the empty string. That's just double quote, double quote. But if text.last is not nil, then we end up creating a constant called last character, and then down below the velvet ropes of the last curly in the guard statement, we'll say print, yeah, we got a last character, and we'll say single quote, put string interp inside, and then inside the parentheses for string interp, as I start to type in last, look, last character shows up in code completion, so the value that we created in guard let lives outside of the curlies for the return. That's the difference between guard let and if. Guard let will create a constant that has the scope of the whole function. Press return because we want last character. Now remember, since we've got a return in this function, we've still got a return at the end here, but we'll say return last character, and last character is a single character. We want to return a string though, so we'll wrap that in a string for type conversion. Then let's try this out below. We'll say text equals, and in quotes we'll put in Swift, all uppercase. Then after that we'll say text equals return last character, and we'll pass in text as our text parameter. Then down below that we'll print out returned equals string interp, surround that by single quotes, and print out text inside the string interp. Shift return, we see down below, we say, yeah, we got a last character and it's a T, and we returned the T. Let's try the same thing down here, but we'll change text equal to empty string, then highlight these two lines up here, copy them with a Command C, paste them down below. I'll give myself a little bit of space in here so we can see the difference between these two blocks of statements. Do a shift return, and we see we don't print out the yes statement because the bouncer bounced us early with the return, and we print out at the end here, we return the empty string. Nice, exactly what we want. So now it's time for a challenge. Why don't you return to WordGarden and modify the guest letter field changed function so that it tries to get the last letter that the user has entered into the guest letter text field. Now, if the last letter is a valid character, then put this character into the text property of guest letter text field. But if the character is not a valid character, hint, that'd mean that it's nil, then put an empty string into the text property of the guest letter text field. Now the end result should be whatever the user types in or pastes, because copy and paste works in iPhone too, into the text field will show a single character that's the character typed, or if the user presses the delete key so that no characters are left, then the empty string should be what's in the text field. Make sure that if the empty string is in there, that the guest letter button is disabled, but make sure that it's enabled if there is a character in the guest letter button. Why don't you pause, give this a shot. We'll solve the solution in the next video, and we'll go over a couple of other new techniques too. Keep at it, coder.